just like to thank our sponsor, Local Roasters, for providing our coffee for this event. The coffee that they've provided for us today is Kenya Omar. Let me get this extra mic on. So next month's Coffee with the Curator is going to be on June 26th. Make note of that because it's not our usual third Thursday. That is the following Thursday than usual because the third Thursday next month falls on Juneteenth, National Freedom Day. So we pushed it back a week, and on June 26th, Lim Shepard, who is a musician and historian from Pittsburgh, Kansas, is going to be giving his presentation, African American Musicians in Kansas from 1860 to 1920. And that will be free to the public thanks to Humanities Kansas, who's sponsoring that event. Lim Shepard says about his talk, African American musicians from 1860 to 1920 are often part of an undertold story in Kansas history. Not defined as traditionally Black music, these musicians played in mandolin quartets, cornet bands, orchestras, and string bands. They performed as itinerant musicians and jubilee singers at civic events, weddings, fairs, barn dances, and private homes. They were an important feature of the musical landscape of Kansas, and their history mirrors the history of our state itself, the struggle of abolition, the Civil War, and Western migration. This talk explores the dynamic musical history of African Americans and the social and cultural impacts in Kansas. Lim Shepard will also perform musical samples, so we hope to see you there on June 26th, Coffee with the Curator. We also have coming up much more soon, Cocktails with the Curator. That is our quarterly event for folks 21 and up. I think most of you make the age cutoff for that, and we would love to see y'all there. We'll have a cash bar, and we have 4, we call them shots of history, little mini talks about 15 minutes long from staff members who will be talking about fun or niche or strange topics in history. And it's a good time. We do all of our research, but we also let our hair down a little bit, so it'll be fun to see some of y'all there on May 22nd, and that starts at 5:00 p.m. on May 22nd. So today we are delighted to be hosting Dr. Lewis Eliot, Assistant Professor of British Imperial History at the University of Oklahoma, where he has worked since 2021. Dr. Eliot completed his PhD at the University of South Carolina, his master's at Queen's University, Belfast, and his bachelor's at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, which is his hometown. Dr. Eliot was raised by a single mother from Cape Town, South Africa, and grew up in Brixton, an area of London home to a large community of Caribbean immigrants. These twin experiences led to a fascination with the place of non-white imperial subjects and the structures of the British Empire. So his talk today is taken from his book, Languages of Liberty, Black Radical Revolution and Diplomatic Abolitionism in Britain's Atlantic World, which is forthcoming with the University of California Press. So keep your eyes out for that. Without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Lewis Eliot.
Thank you for inviting me up to Wichita, and it's great to see you all here. I'm sorry I have no musical samples for you today, so you're just going to have to listen to me talking. Today, I'm going to be talking about the development of 2 very different ideologies of liberty that developed in the British Empire. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries. I'll start with a quick explanation of what these 2 ideologies were and how they developed. I will then look at how they manifested through the story of Boosa's Rebellion, an enslaved uprising that took place in Barbados in 1816. And I will end with how these 2 competing visions of liberty endured after the revolt. Enslaved people throughout the Americas constantly fought to end their enslavement in a number of ways. For example, they ran away. They participated in strikes, work slowdowns, and the destruction of harvests. They covertly practiced their native religions, they spoke their mother tongues, and they practiced their cultures. And most famously, they rose up in rebellion. White people in both the Americas and in European metropoles often characterized these rebellions as extensions of other kinds of resistance, knee-jerk, emotional responses to enslavement. But in reality, they were political revolutions that not only sought to reject slavery, but replace it with a form of freedom of their own design. But more on that in a little bit. Anti-slavery in Britain, where there was only a very small population of black people and only a tiny fraction of whom were enslaved, was rather more conceptual and assumed certain things about black liberatory ideology. They saw their own freedom as the same thing that black people desired, and they went about campaigning on their behalf with a few rather problematic assumptions about black people. This is best summarized by this medallion, designed in 1787 by the artist William Hackwood, and commissioned by the abolitionist and businessman Josiah Wedgwood, and produced in his ceramics factory. It was worn as a lapel pin by like-minded men, as a brooch or a necklace by like-minded women, and disseminated throughout the world very widely, including a case of 2,000 of them sent to Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia. Consequently, Wedgwood's enslaved African became perhaps the most famous black person in the Western world. Wedgwood's figure did not only exist as jewelry. This is a print version used as the letterhead of the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society in the 1820s. It shows more clearly some of its details, and I want to draw your attention to a couple of those now. Firstly, the figure is barely clothed and completely subservient. He is depicted pleading with the British Empire to treat him as a man and a brother, implying that black people were powerless to act on their own account. Secondly, he is chained to himself. His enforced servitude is therefore not a product of white domination over black bodies, but a self-inflicted condition brought about by the color of his skin and its supposed accompanying inferiorities. Wedgwood's figure is representative of common contemporary assumptions about the dialogue between enslaved people and their abolitionist supporters in the late 1700s. Although most people in Britain and its colonies understood that enslaved people wanted their freedom, whites sympathetic to that desire believed that only they could secure that victory and had to do so without the input of the enslaved. Per Wedgwood's representation, white Britons felt that enslaved people were content to submit to white authority over their bodies and minds, hoping that loyalty to metropolitan abolitionist ideologies would win over their enslavers. Of course, Wedgwood could not have been more wrong. The next image I'm going to show you is a contemporary recreation of a flag used by enslaved rebels during Booth's Rebellion, that enslaved rebellion in Barbados I mentioned before. As you will see, it contains a very different message about black attitudes towards anti-slavery and contains within it an ideology of liberty that ran in direct opposition to a vision of freedom that whites directed on their behalf. Though subsequent reports of the uprising suggest that its progress, quote, indicated a want of concert and premeditation, and disagreed with the notion of any deep-laid or extensively ramified conspiracy, the very existence of this flag reveals that the authors of this report both misrepresented the meticulous preparation that went into Booth's Rebellion and fundamentally misunderstood the character of enslaved rebellions more broadly. Its imagery reveals the actions black people were willing to take to secure their freedom, and more importantly, what they expected that freedom to look like. Firstly, the white figure in the foreground likely represents King George III, who waves a banner declaring "Royal Endeavour and Forever." Behind the king sits Britannia herself on a British lion, commenting that Britannia is always happy to lead such sons as endeavourants. Undergirding these messages across the base of the banner is a declared belief that God always saves endeavour. The repetition of the word endeavour explains how much effort enslaved people expected to undertake to gain their freedom. The explicit support of both the king and the incarnation of the empire herself shows that enslaved people expected a measure of support from the monarchy and British public and only needed to defeat the local plantocracy. The presence of 2 muskets also explains that the insurgents were ready for the conflict against the white colonists to be violent. Sitting above the muskets on the flag are depicted 2 axes. Their presence conveys more than the expectation of violence, and is most likely a nod to the role that obeah, the term for West African healing and spiritual traditions recreated by enslaved people in the British Americas, would have played in the formation of both Boosa's rebellion itself and the central role that African cultures was to play in post-revolution independent Barbados. The double axe, or ose, was one of the symbols of Sango, a royal ancestor among the Yoruba people, and deified as a god of justice and punishment. His symbols and mythology likely had a significant role in the practice of obeah, and the connection between its practice and the enslaved uprisings was well known, in particular in the years after the Haitian Revolution of 1804. A black woman on the flag establishes the involvement of women in the enslaved struggle for emancipation. Enslaved and free men were not without women allies in their revolutionary activities, and this is likely a depiction of a literate enslaved woman from Simmons Plantation named Nanny Grigg, who worked as a domestic. Rick routinely helped herself to the discarded newspapers and publications of her owner and relayed the information contained within to her illiterate comrades. Her literacy, which was a prime status symbol in colonial society, gave Grigg an authority not shared by many enslaved people. More revealing in the flag than either the expected support of the king and the British people was its explanation of what Boosa's followers expected their emancipation to look like. The black man in the center of the flag has a crown rather larger than that of the king, and looking very much the part of a Regency gentleman is most likely a free black man named Washington Franklin, who was the intellectual leader of the 1816 rebellion. Franklin was the progeny of a white father named Joseph Pitt and a black enslaved woman. Pitt owned Franklin's mother and kept Washington as a slave until he turned 21. Franklin's name was also formerly Joseph Pitt, but at some point in adulthood, he dropped any nomenclature associated with his slaveholding father and preferred to use the more revolutionary names of Washington and Franklin. He lived near Bailey's Plantation in Barbados and was well known to many of the rebellion organizers. He was also literate and very, very charming, and was therefore the natural choice to become governor of the island upon the successful overthrow of the planters. A surviving rebel named Robert confirmed as much while under interrogation. Yet most striking on the flag is the implications of the Royal Navy vessel leaving the scene. Boosa's army not only expected black control of Barbados, replacing their white masters, but also an ending of British rule on the island. Though the gun ports of the man-of-war are open, signifying once again that the rebel army knew of the dangers of Britain's maritime might, its sailing east, back to the metropole, implied that confidence in victory. Boosa's rebellion was the first large-scale and consciously planned enslaved uprising in the British Caribbean since Haitians announced their independence as a black republic. The momentousness of that declaration was one not lost on either British Caribbean planters or their enslaved laborers. The formation of the Haitian state quickly became not only a source of inspiration for bondspeople throughout the Americas, but also confirmation that their emancipatory desires could come with a revolutionary and liberatory ideology. Boosa's rebels were therefore both energized by the Haitian Revolution and specifically hoped to recreate it in Barbados. Emblazoned across the top of the flag are the words, "Happiness remains forever with endeavorance." Combined with a Regency dress of the black man and empire style of Grig, the use of the word happiness is perhaps a synonym for freedom, as understood within the ideologically liberal context of other political revolutions of the late 18th and early 19th century Atlantic world. The flag is therefore quite bourgeois in its intent. Having heard and understood not only the revolutionary emancipation of their Haitian brothers and sisters, but also their post-independence ideologies of liberty, the rebels of 1816 laid out their declaration of an independent Barbados in this flag with unambiguous clarity and ideological coherence. Barbadians of African descent had loves, fears, values, life objectives, and in spite of their enslavement, sought to develop these to the fullest. Their decision to revolt had much to do with the protection of these things. Should they have achieved the liberty to enjoy such unshackled humanity, this flag explains the ideological foundations upon which they would have pursued that happiness. Other than so rich a source as this flag, one has to wonder why Booth's rebellion is important for revealing a divergent ideology of liberty that energized enslaved people throughout the British Empire. Simply, it is because it happened in Barbados. This is key because the island could and should be understood as the first slaveholding colony of what would become the British Empire. All Britain's other colonies in the Americas, where slavery was the main economic driver, took their cues from Barbados. What worked in Barbados worked everywhere else. And importantly for us today, when things did not work, the rest of the empire looked on very nervously. That said, enslaved uprisings in the tiny, densely populated island were rare. Barbados is very small, only 166 square miles, sparsely forested and very flat. Military and law enforcement could easily communicate across the whole island in mere minutes using flags on their observation towers and move quickly throughout the island to dampen hints of insurrectionary behavior before enslaved people could properly organize themselves. Even though nearly 500,000 Africans were taken to work on the island across the 300-year span of the British transatlantic slave trade, with an enslaved population of over 80,000 in 1816 compared to only 17,000 free people, some Barbadian planters were so convinced of their safety that they routinely slept without even locking their doors. So when Booth's rebellion erupted, it reverberated throughout the empire and informed both the imperial state and white abolitionists in the metropole that enslaved people had their own ideas about freedom. Before we get into the story of the rebellion, I want to provide a little bit of an update about what abolitionists in Britain had been doing since Wedgwood began selling his medallion in 1787. They had achieved an enormous victory in 1807 with the abolition of Britain's legal slave trade to the Americas. This was their first goal, and considering that opposition to the slave trade had been a controversial, radical, and highly unpopular political position just 20 years previously, this was extremely impressive. It was also a victory that garnered huge support from the enslaved population of the empire. When they heard that no more ships transporting their black brothers and sisters would arrive on their shores, they felt justifiably that it would not take long for those abolitionists to secure their freedom too. But they were to be disappointed by what these abolitionists decided to do next. Emboldened by their ending of the legal transatlantic slave trade to British territories, the attitude of many Britons was one of assumed pioneering progressivism. Most applauded this as a triumphant minting of moral capital and proof of Britain's advanced civility. Support continued among the imperial public for expanding this prohibition of slave trading beyond British borders, instead of addressing the continued atrocities that slavers committed under their own jurisdiction. The African institution, formed in 1807 as a beacon to synthesize this presumption of superiority, decided that extinguishing the triangle trade would starve the institution of slavery throughout the Atlantic world and lead, eventually, to complete emancipation. This was a conversation in which whites engaged without thought to the immorality of slavery or opinions of black imperial subjects within an empire that now prided itself as one of liberty. But of course, the enslaved population of the empire had a very different view of their imperial masters. A group of enslaved and free black people in Barbados were becoming increasingly frustrated at the lack of progress with regards to their freedom in early 1816 and began planning to take matters into their own hands. Though the rebellion bears his name, unfortunately very little is known about Busa. Other than archival confirmation of his being a driver on Bailey's plantation at the time of the uprising, and enslaved testimony naming him the military leader, Busa makes barely a mark on the historical record. This is variously explained away because he was a battlefield commander and not an organizer, that his likely death in combat rendered his name superfluous in subsequent interrogations, or because the Barbadian plantocracy, fearful of creating martyrs, had no intention of highlighting the role of revolutionary leadership. Busa's position as general of the revolution suggests previous experience in organized combat, and he was therefore perhaps African-born. That the man credited as the leader of the revolt was likely born in Africa is surprising. The 1817 Barbados census details that only 7% of the island's population hailed from Africa or Europe. Even before the end of Britain's legal transatlantic slave trading, planters were highly concerned about connections between enslaved people born in Africa and colonial disquiet, and therefore overwhelmingly preferred enslaved Creoles, people of African descent born in the Americas. They believed that African-born enslaved people were more rebellious than their Caribbean-born comrades, and in part, the ban on slave trading was intended to ease these concerns. Even so, the 1807 Act did little to relax the hysteria of many whites who remained convinced that, quote, these Africans, being chiefly savage warriors taken in battle, brought along with them all the ignorance, all the prejudice, and all the superstitious and immoral practices of their countrymen. Giving an African-born enslaved man the role of driver is similarly unexpected, given its independent nature. Were Busa truly African-born, he would have needed time to gain the trust of his owners to the extent that he'd be appointed a driver. Of course, alternatively, if he was a recent arrival, planters might have trusted him to administer discipline, confident that he would not be punishing established brethren. Just as the place of Busa's birth remains unclear, so does his age. Were he a former military commander in West Africa, he could have been well into his 50s by 1816. Given this plausibly advanced maturity, he would have likely remembered hearing inspirational reports of Toussaint Louverture's successes in Haiti throughout the 1790s as a younger man. He may even have been old enough to hear tales of Tacky's War from Jamaica in 1760. Whatever was true about Busa, he certainly commanded the trust of the white population of the St. Philip's Parish plantation on which he lived, and the loyalty and respect of both enslaved and free black people. Whether through fond misremembrance or persistent oral correction of the written record, Busa's name is the one most feted among the other enslaved and free orchestrators. Unfortunately, scarce accounts survive to develop a comprehensive understanding of how the enslaved revolutionaries of Barbados conceived of and hoped to execute their uprising. The enslaved man Robert, who provided the most detailed explanation of how the rebellion began, is the source on which we must rely. Under interrogation, he explained that a commanding group of enslaved drivers, rangers, and carters organized the uprising. This is not a surprise, given the abilities of enslaved people of those ranks to move between plantations and gather support for their cause under the cover of their forced labor. Robert identified the leaders as enslaved men named Jackie, Mingo, King William, Prince William, Toby, Little Sambo, Will Nightingale, and Charles. Jackie, who was a Creole driver at Simmons Plantation, oversaw planning the rebellion and had been recruiting like-minded enslaved men and women for the preceding 3 months. As to why the rebellion occurred, there are various accounts, but all point to rumors of an emancipation order coming from Britain that Barbadian planters had ignored. Nanny Grigg, the woman likely depicted on the flag I showed you before, had read in a colonial periodical in late 1815 that emancipation was imminent, to come on New Year's Day, 1860. Armed with this revelation, she told her enslaved comrades that, quote, they were all damn fools to work beyond early January of that year. As 1816 progressed, and without signs of her liberty forthcoming, she felt that if whites in Barbados continued to withhold what she was sure was her legal right to freedom, her and her fellow enslaved people would be forced to, quote, set fire for it. Reports like the one Grigg took from her owners, explaining how, quote, Saint Domingo has again become the theater of massacre and bloodshed, the last remnants of French power almost completely overthrown, thrilled black readers and listeners as much as they horrified whites. In Barbados, such reports appeared to black Barbadians as an inflammatory sign for those of African descent to reject imperial slavery. Just as participation in the rebellion was not limited to men, nor was it solely the work of the enslaved. Many free people of color helped Bucer, Jackie, and the others, including Washington Franklin, who was to be named governor upon the successful overthrow of imperial rule. Many free black people saw revolution as the only way by which they might achieve a more comfortable existence. A surviving rebel named Daniel told interrogators that a free man named Cain Davis recruited him by convincing him that emancipation would take place over the Easter weekend of 1816. Daniel was initially skeptical, but another free man named Richard Sargent confirmed Davis's promise at a Good Friday dance that many of the organizers had attended. According to Robert, Bucer delivered his orders for how the revolution would proceed at that Good Friday dance. He explained how they were to, quote, set fires, as that is the way they did it in St. Domingo. Another survivor, James Boland, presented a similar story to Robert, though identified different leaders. He named Bucer, King Wiltshire, Dick Bailey, Johnny, and Johnny Cooper as the chief troublemakers. Enslaved survivors often named those they believed to have been killed, hoping to escape further punishment by cooperating and stifling the chance of further interrogations of others. According to Boland, Bucer's instructions were to, quote, fight for liberty in the same way as they had done in St. Domingo. Bucer's army began setting fire to cane fields at about 8:30 in the evening on the 14th of April, 1816. The rebellion was initially organized for later that night. The enormity of the occasion was such that one rebel behaved rashly. According to the colonial governor, James Leith, quote, there is every reason to believe that the premature bursting out of the insurrection was occasioned by the intoxication of one of the revolters. Bucer had arranged for that first night to be marked by burning cane fields, with subsequent days reserved for overwhelming the whites who were distracted by the destruction of their harvest, or, as a militiaman named John Best put it, quote, the murder of white men. As the flag I just showed you suggests, Bucer organized his followers as a professional army, using banners and insignia to announce their presence on the battlefield and coordinate tactically. The insurgents supplemented the flags and banners that displayed their ideologies of liberty and the nature of their vengeance against white colonists. Another example, long since lost, presented, quote, a rude drawing that served to inflame the passions by representing the union of a black man with a white female. This particular flag had, quote, a red background against which was depicted a black man and a white woman having sexual relations. The choice of red as the flag's field was neither haphazard nor simply out of convenience. It was chosen to be visible for both Booth's military coordinating and to ensure their white adversaries saw the deliberately calculated insult. The first garrisons to respond to Booth's arson did not initially engage because the revolutionaries also flew the colours of the St. Philip militia that they had stolen. Unfortunately, by dawn on the second day of the revolution, the rebel army was similarly confused, as 200 black soldiers of the British Army's West India Regiment had arrived to aid the militia. While the Haitian Revolution was still a fresh nightmare in white minds, Booth's men hoped that their uprising might receive aid from Haitian forces. The presence of black men in uniform stalled their revolutionary activities long enough for the imperial plantocracy to gain an understanding of the situation. It is likely that Booth had died during that Tuesday morning conflict with the West India Regiment. Despite his probable death, Booth's soldiers continued setting fires well into the following day. According to a white witness, quote, the sugar canes were blazing on every side, the rascals setting fire to them before our eyes. Just as the loss of revenue distracted whites, Booth's soldiers then spread their emancipatory message throughout Barbados. This plan worked well. Even on that first night reserved for arson, black revolutionaries had made it to urban areas in the parish of St. John, where they rushed through the streets, causing consternation among white residents. One second, guys, I'm sorry. Word of fires reached Bridgetown at about 2 o'clock on Tuesday morning, when messengers informed Colonel Edward Codd, the commander of the island's garrison. Codd hesitated, waiting for intelligence about the numbers and whereabouts of Booth's army, and sincerely hoped that the local militia had sufficient men and knowledge to address the uprising without military help. That militia was so confident that Codd held off until 10 o'clock in the morning, by which time it became clear that the situation required more seasoned campaigners. Arriving in St. Anne's Parish with the West India Regiment in tow, Codd realized the extent of the challenge with which he was faced. Booth had organized his troops to attack in a combination of strategies. Some, armed with firelock pistols, cane knives, pikes, and hatchets, baited and taunted the militia posse, Codd's regulars, and the West India Regiment, which distracted them from stopping the arsonists' square. Codd's men also struggled with how Booth had used what little coverage the land offered. He recalled that, quote, such indeed was the warfare pursued by these people, that in no position could I discover them in sufficient numbers to attack. Whenever Codd's men did discover companies of enslaved soldiers, they scattered, but all the while carried out Booth's orders. Faced with an increasingly catastrophic loss of harvest from the cane fires, a desperate Codd decided to turn arsonist himself. He felt that the only way to prevent an escalation of the revolution to the one of the magnitude of Haiti's was to destroy the houses of enslaved people and so deprive them of their refuges and resources. He therefore set fire to the dwellings of the revolutionaries and their comrades. Sadly, this incendiary approach worked. Rebels rushed home to save what few possessions they had and beg for mercy. Faced with the loss of their dwellings, Bucer's soldiers deserted their emancipatory cause to protect their families, and in so doing, the solidarity born out of a hopeful revolution began to burn out. Without sufficient numbers to continue the struggle, Bucer's rebellion sputtered and died. Under interrogation, Bucer's rebels were belligerent in maintaining their aims for the uprising. Bucer's soldiers insisted that, quote, the island belonged to them and not to white men whom they proposed to destroy. As they worked the land, they surely held claim to its ownership and were adamant that they desired emancipation and freedom of the same ilk that created the Haitian state. The surviving members of Bucer's army were sure to stress that they only wished harm on the white men of the island, who they planned to expel upon their victory. They planned on, quote, reserving the females, whose lot, in case of success, it is easy to conceive. Even so, only a few whites suffered injuries, as Bucer's army avoided hurting most non-combatants. Perhaps surprisingly, the Barbadian administration selected only a few of the most flagrant offenders to be executed. And for the most part, colonial governor Leith believed that they seemed to have accepted their fates. But they also remained unwaveringly convinced of the validity of their revolutionary actions. The rebel leader Johnny, in particular, was steadfast in his loyalty to Bucer even when climbing the gallows. George Maynard, an Anglican priest who attended the executions, felt that they were put to death as scapegoats and were not truly an accurate representation of the leadership. One execution he attended was that of a youth who had joined the chaos without considering the consequences and had therefore not fought for his liberty so much as due to innocent foolishness. Another, named Sandy Waterman, had been recently baptized and so believed he was free because of his conversion. Although Governor Leith wanted to extinguish the revolution as peacefully as possible, he remained committed to the murderous underpinnings of a system of slavery that demanded capital punishment for any attempted rejection of bondage. One anonymous diarist witnessed executions of suspected rebels continuing into September of 1816, with an ultimate Black Death count of just under 2,000 people between the revolutionary battles, state-initiated executions, and extrajudicial lynchings. A few rebels did turn on their comrades under interrogation and received lesser punishments. Jack, Jackie, Quamine, William Webb, and Caesar were even manumitted, emancipated, for, quote, good conduct in giving information of the late rebellion. Another, Bob, who may well have been the Robert whose testimony we have relied upon, also received his freedom for, quote, for having given such information subsequent to the rebellion as prevented a second insurrection. 124 others were removed to Honduras and sold for plantation work there, and 85 others were exiled to the new British colony of Sierra Leone. Bucer's rebellion failed to end slavery or secure Barbados as an independent black state, as the revolutionaries desired. Yet it terrified the imperial plantocracy and loudly reminded whites in the metropole of black attitudes towards freedom. The insistence of survivors that they planned to overthrow their masters and that the Haitian Revolution lived through them forced imperial leadership to reconsider their approach to slave labor. It also returned the focus of metropolitan abolitionist communities away from West Africa and back to the Caribbean. Bucer and his followers ensured that despite the 1807 abolition of the British slave trade, the slavery question required continued attention and that the voices and actions of black people in the West Indies should be part of that fate. The government inquiry into the causes of the revolt stated unequivocally that it was the fault of free, literate black people like Washington Franklin, who spread rumors of emancipation to conceive an overthrow of the Barbadian plantocracy and install an independent black administration. Among leaders in the British Imperial administration, the question therefore turned immediately to how best to combat this rumor-mongering, or, more likely, how to try and persuade enslaved people to side with the empire, rather than those they saw as external agitators. This led to an uneasy alliance between plantation owners and missionary societies, as the white people with the closest contact with the enslaved throughout the empire. Planters had traditionally seen missionaries as zealous instigators of disorder, and a vocal minority of the planters even blamed them for the rebellion itself and strove to restrict or entirely prohibit missionary work. Yet they ultimately conceded that were enslaved people throughout the empire, through an enlarged missionary presence better supervised, they might become less inclined to rebel against their owners. This solution had the added benefit of reorientating black ideologies of freedom around the gospel, rather than allowing the enslaved to formulate their own thoughts themselves. Before 1817, there were only a few hundred missionaries in the West Indies. Most were members of the Anglican Church, though there were some Baptists, Wesleyans, and Quakers there too. In the years after Booth's rebellion, that number swelled into the thousands. The nonconformist groups in particular had a history of anti-slavery teachings, but gave their missionaries the strictest of instructions not to discuss slavery in any way when leading worship with enslaved people. In 1816, a Baptist missionary named John Smith arrived in Demerara, which is modern-day Guyana, as part of this army of religious teachers sent from Britain to mollify the enslaved population and suppress black ideas about freedom. His supervisors at the London Missionary Society insisted that, quote, "Not a word must escape you, in public or in private, which might render the slaves displeased with their masters or dissatisfied with their stations." What none of the whites who conceived of or executed this plan realized was that the messages of the gospel would mean something very different to the enslaved. In 1823, two of John Smith's congregation, an enslaved man named Quamina and his son Jack, took Jesus' teachings to mean that they were permitted to fight for a liberty of their own making. That summer, they recreated Booth's rebellion in Demerara on a still larger scale, demonstrating that white efforts to present a single meaning of freedom to the enslaved had not worked, and that a black ideology of liberty was alive and well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Eliot. For the Q&A here, I have a microphone. The speaker can hear any questions a little bit better. I'll start off with one that I have for you. I know that you use a lot of primary sources in your research, but were there any in particular that stood out to you or that you were shocked by when you first came across them, or got really excited about?
Yeah, that's a very good question. This is obviously the product of a lot of sifting through very moldy, very dusty books in Britain, in the US, in Barbados. I think what I was most shocked by was silence. So when I started this project, so the book that I've written is a series of case studies. This is the first chapter of 6 rebellions that I look at. And I knew I wanted to write about rebellions, but I also thought that would be easy. Of course, people would be talking about these things. They're huge, momentous events. And so what really surprised me was how little They were discussed, even by the missionary societies that I look at, by the governments in both the colonies and the metropole. I think because there was a desire to suppress information about what was going on, to present a more peaceful vision of the empire than was real. And so there was a lot of digging and sort of reading through sources that I had to do to extract these stories. I think also in terms of things that I did see that I was surprised by, I think the honesty of those being interrogated, who I think it would be reasonable to think that they would lie to try and preserve themselves, right? They've already been captured, they are in prison, they are likely to be put to death, and yet they are completely honest about what was going on. Well, I think that they were being completely honest about what was going on, which I think was very surprising, which I think suggests a unified ideology and a commitment to a vision, not just for themselves, but for who would come after.
How do view this history now in high school and college? How do they view it?
That's a very good question, and it's a very sad answer, unfortunately. So I went to high school in Britain, and I heard about precisely none of this. I knew about racial struggle from my mother, who was from Cape Town, who grew up in apartheid South Africa. But in terms of sort of formal organized education, you have to wait till college, and even then you do electives for this sort of thing. And it really stems from that post-1807 ideology, because Britain saw themselves as the first to abolish the slave trade, not that that was even true, that they present themselves as the pioneers there. There's been a sort of presumption of, one, progressivism, and secondly, that slavery is something very foreign, right? And I think that is also partly because there were very few enslaved people in Britain, even when slavery was legal there. It was a decidedly foreign phenomenon, the purview of, in particular, Catholic empires like the Spanish and the Portuguese and the French, or the United States. So when you talk about the history of Britain, it doesn't really come up. That is changing now. The aftermath of the 2020 summer Black Lives Matter movement, which was incredibly international, has led to the beginnings of a reevaluation of that. But even then, it is quite regional. In urban areas like London, where I grew up, that you're starting to see more public engagement with this legacy. And in port cities like Bristol, Liverpool, Glasgow, where the slave trade was financed and came from, you're starting to see that, but nationwide, there's still a way to go.
A month or so ago, I was seeing something on TV, and I always criticize people for not wondering about stuff. And then I found out I had wondered about what did the British do with the slaves that they got off the slave ships. I had never thought about that. It said something, and you mentioned Sierra Leone today. There was something about they took them mainly, maybe not, so back to Africa and put them to work someplace. About how many slaves did the British Navy, whoever freed, and what happened to them?
Oh, thank you for that question. That gives me a chance to talk about my second book, which is about that. So when Britain abolished the slave trade, as I mentioned, it was this sort of presumption of superiority and civility. Aren't we fantastic for doing this? It only stopped about 30% of British traders. It was very, very easy to avoid capture. The Atlantic Ocean is a big place, and it's really quite easy to get by, right? Finding friendly ports where slavery and the slave trade was still legal, like Havana, like Rio, Charleston, Savannah, places like that. So firstly, very little changed until the 1820s and 30s, when other empires started to abolish the slave trade as well, where it became harder and harder to extract Africans forcibly from West Africa. As to what they did when they rarely did capture, officially, they were supposed to go back to the UK, go back to Britain, because the enslaved Africans were witnesses to the crimes of the ship's crew. That clashed with the fervent desire domestically to have no black people in Britain. So that very rarely happened. If it was close to the African coast, they were likely turned around and taken to either Freetown or Cape Town in South Africa, where they were put to work on plantations there. So these are people who aren't from Sierra Leone. They're not from Sierra Leone. They're not from South Africa. They're usually from either the Horn of Africa, further south of Sierra Leone, or even from East Africa. And they're just dumped on the coast and given to plantation owners, effectively slavery. In the because the British realized that that last generation of the enslaved are starting to come out of the workforce, plantation production in the British Caribbean starts to dip. So instead of taking these, what they were called liberated Africans, back to Africa, they were dropped in the Caribbean and expected to do plantation work there as well. So the colony of Trinidad and Tobago, right on the south of the Caribbean, was a very common destination for them. It wasn't slavery. It wasn't hereditary. And it wasn't slavery in the sense that they were given a nominal wage for that work. But in all other respects, it was still slavery. And that continued until the 1880s.
Okay. So in my experience as an archaeologist, I've tried doing research into more of the Haitian slave revolt.
Okay, yeah.
But really the Caribbean slave trade as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
I've noticed there is not a lot of public access at all, let alone in English. Most of it's in French. What do you think the reasoning behind that is, and what can we do to fix that to make it more accessible for the average person to learn about it?
So make what more accessible?
Just learning about what happened. I can't seem to, like, when I did my research, I couldn't find much of anything.
So I think that's a hard question. That's a good question. It's a hard question because there's a lot of gatekeeping when it comes to academia, right? Unless you have access to a university library and you know what to look for, you're in a bit of trouble, right? For the Haitian Revolution specifically, there was a really good New York Times op-ed with a lot of links to where they found their information that came out about 2 or 3 years ago, which I would really recommend. Beyond that, I would have a look at secondary authors. So the beauty of the Haitian Revolution in particular is that it was the first and only successful revolution, right? It was enslaved people who had a vision of liberty and they executed. All the other revolutions that came after, including the one that you heard about today, was ultimately unsuccessful, right? That one lasted a few days. Some of them lasted a couple of months. Mostly they were suppressed within hours, right? So because of that, there's actually very little primary information, and you're relying on historians to sort of do that digging. The Haitian Revolution, because it lasted nearly 13 years, and because it was successful, and because it had massive ramifications for European imperialism and the concept of nationhood as a whole, has been engaged with a lot more. Where I would start would be C.L.R. James, The Black Jacobins, who wrote a book about Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the Haitian Revolt in the 1930s, and that really triggered a huge interest in the Haitian Revolution since then. So that's where I would start, and then I think that will give you the rabbit hole to go down for sure.
Can you go over the amount of military that was on the island at the time of the revolution? I know you said there were like 500 troops came from Haiti, black soldiers,
Mhm.
but how many were on the island permanently?
Yeah, so that's a good question because the concept of military garrisons, it gives an image of well-stocked barracks and a naval presence and sort of an organized military, right? That wasn't quite true. The British Empire in 1816 wasn't nearly as large as it would become later in the 19th century, but it was still extensive. And a posting in the Caribbean was the one that none of the soldiers wanted. So it was very difficult to attract, especially army soldiers, because there was no conscription, in sufficient numbers to staff these garrisons. And so, in particular in the Caribbean, they were very reliant on the West India Regiment, which was the all-black regiment of the army. So they had white officers, but the enlisted men were all of African descent. There were 200 of them in Barbados. That was by far the largest corps of that regiment. There were others in Jamaica, there were others in Trinidad, and before the American Revolution, they were based in Charleston, South Carolina. The Navy, it was a little bit easier because of impressment, essentially conscription into the Navy. So the naval vessels were better stocked, but also constantly moving around the Caribbean. The main base was in Kingston, Jamaica, which is quite away from Barbados. And so it would have taken a while to move troops throughout the Caribbean. Instead of soldiers, then, most plantation societies relied upon militia. Okay, so these were amateur law enforcement, given a small stipend in return for being that first line of defense against any potential insurrection. All white people in the Caribbean were expected to serve in those militia, and they were organized county by county. And it was quite a prestigious honor to be given a commission in your local militia. Because of that, they were susceptible to a huge amount of abuse and bribery. So you didn't have the best in charge of these things. You had the richest, which is not always the best way of doing things, which explains, I think, why the militia was so unable to take control of the situation, and it required the professional soldiers to come up from Bridgetown to do that. So in terms of numbers, it depends on the it depends on the colony, but we're not talking about big numbers here. Much smaller. The Navy again was much better served. There were 2 battleships posted in Barbados at this point, which is, for a small island like that, that's heavy defense. But they were mostly there to defend against potential invasion from the Spanish or the French. They weren't really there to stop enslaved uprisings.
As far as losses go, you said there were none killed, but only like a handful, 8 or so wounded. Did I understand that correctly?
No, that was in reference to non-combatants.
Oh,
No white people who weren't involved in the militia or the army
do you know
were
what
killed.
the losses were of the militia?
The militia lost about 130. The West India Regiment lost 2. So it's not big numbers.
Do we have any more questions I missed? All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Eliot, for your time. That was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you all.
So just a reminder to everyone, our next coffee with the curator is a week later than usual. That is June 26th. So I hope to see you all there. And also, both that and our next Senior Wednesday are free to the public thanks to Humanities Kansas that provided a grant for those next two. So on June 4th, when Isaiah McCaffrey, Professor of History at Independence Community College, he'll be giving a talk called Last Stand at Rebel Creek about the Osage as Union allies in Civil War Kansas. And then we also have cocktails with the curator coming up very soon on May 22nd. So we hope to see you all at those programs coming up. Oh, my microphone's dying on me. But thank you all for being here and have a wonderful day. Enjoy your coffee and tea and everything, and hope to see you all at the next one. Thank you.